Welcome, Yenis. If you are new around here, welcome to a Yin Yoga podcast. I'm super glad that you're here. For those of you that are return listeners, welcome back. Before we get into today's subject, which was a question, by the way, that somebody had asked, did you know that you can send me questions? So if you have a burning yin question, now it's got to be yin related or yin adjacent. Otherwise, I won't cover it on the podcast because this is a yin yoga podcast after all. But did you know, dear listener, that you can send me questions? The best way to do that is to find me on Instagram, either at Nick Danu Yoga or at Yin Yoga Podcast. Both of those will be in the show notes of this episode. And then just send me a DM and let me know what question you have or what topic you think that's yin related that isn't on the podcast yet that really needs to be. And I'm happy to make that happen. So this was one of those questions. We'll get into it in a moment. The question basically was, and this question's come up in a few different ways from different people, but like, how do you keep it fresh when you're teaching? Or how do you not get bored when you're teaching? Right. So that's kind of what we're going to go over. How do we not get bored when we're teaching our yin classes? How do we keep it fresh? That's what we're going to talk about today. But before we do, first reminder, dear listener, this is an adult podcast with adult subject matter and adult language. Although I have the soul of a mermaid, I also have the mouth of a sailor. So if you have small ones around, pop some headphones in or on now. And I wanted to share a little bit of feedback that I have gotten on my therapeutic yin training. At the time of this recording, it is still a 60+ hour therapeutic yin training, although I am pondering making it longer because I just feel like I want to go deeper with y'all. But at this time, it is still a 60+ hour. So that's 60 hours with me. And then there's also a few mandatory assignments, some homework, and then also just lots of stuff that's not mandatory, but that you can review at your leisure. So podcast episodes, videos, articles, et cetera, et cetera. So it's probably more like 80 or 85 by the time you get all your homework done. But you get 60 hours with me. And at the time of this recording, that's what it's at. We'll see what it's going to be. If you're listening to this in the future, it may be longer. It definitely will not be shorter. But I wanted to just read some very brief feedback that I got from a former student. This is a quick one. I loved Nick's passion and open mind. She was pleasant to listen to and shared her experiences, which will serve me well as an instructor. I plan on teaching all of the tools I learned, and I'm excited to give all of the varied options that I've learned. Keep doing what you're doing. You are a total yin rock star. And that's from Corey. Thank you, Corey. I love the idea of being a yin rock star. Okay, my friends, let's dive into the episode. Oh, one more thing on the teacher training. If you want to get on the wait list, which you definitely should do, because then you get some gifts from me, plus advance registration notice of my training. There's also a link for that. You just click that link. You look way up at the top. You're going to see a picture of me. There's going to be a button there that you could click and enter your name and email, or you could go way at the bottom. Or if you're there long enough, there will be a little polite pop-up that will slide out from the side, and you can get on the list there. Okay. Shall we dive in? Now, for those of you watching this on YouTube, and dear listener, if you're not watching this on YouTube, did you know you could also watch this on YouTube? It's true. I have notes to keep me on track because some of you may have heard me say before, ADD. So if I have a framework, it'll keep me from talking in circles and then not knowing if I've come back to my original point. So I do have some notes, so you will see me kind of looking away from the camera and back. And for those of you listening, if you prefer a video to an audio, know that I upload the totally unedited video to YouTube. So when you are listening, I do edit it. I take out the ums and the spaces and the moments where I stop to drink tea, because that's very confusing and doesn't feel good when you're listening to something. But on YouTube, you just get the straight up, old school, unpolished, delightfully imperfect video that you can watch. So if you are more of a visual person than an audio person, please know that those are there for you as well. Okay, shall we begin? So there's a few ways that we could kind of look at this whole getting bored with teaching thing. And of course, I'm going to talk specifically about how you would approach this in a yin way, because this is a yin podcast. So everything I'm saying is yin related, but I'm sure there's takeaways for all styles of yoga. So the question has been, do you ever get bored in your yin classes? How do you keep it fresh? Another way I heard this phrased was, there's only 20 poses in a yin practice. Do you ever get bored? How do you keep it interesting? Okay, so that's kind of the three ways that I've heard this phrased. First of all, I would like to say, dear yoga teacher listening, yin yoga is not entertainment. One more time. Dear yoga teacher listening, yin yoga is not designed to be entertainment. That being said, I have some tips for you. Okay. First question to ask yourself, are you bored or are your students bored? I think oftentimes as teachers, we assume that because the class sequence or whatever feels predictable for us, that the students must be lying there silently rolling their eyes going, oh, this again? But from my experience, that is not the case. So are you bored or are your students bored? I'm going to break these two apart separately. If you're bored, I got some ideas for you first, and then I've got some ideas for keeping your students, especially the ones that have been with you for a long time, trying to keep them in that sort of beginner's mind. Okay, so are you bored or are your students bored? Don't assume that because everything is uber familiar to you and that your students can kind of get themselves into their favorite version of whatever pose it was that you just mentioned before you were even finished describing it, that they're bored. We'll talk about that coming up. So first of all, don't assume your students are bored, because they probably aren't. I will talk about what to do with that coming up. But dear teacher, if it's you that's bored, here are some things to consider. Number one, do you have a home practice? If you're not practicing at home, then your teaching will be less than inspired when you go out into the world. A lot of the little aha moments or interesting nuggets of wisdom or fun ways to practice a pose, et cetera, come from my own practice, my home practice. Now, I come from a generation of yoga teachers that it was assumed when you signed up for your teacher training that you had an established home practice, that you were committed to practicing on your own at home. And I don't mean with a YouTube video or with at a studio. I mean, your mat, doing your thing. Okay. Now, I realize that this is no longer the standard. And so it may not have even occurred to you that your home practice is an essential tool for keeping things interesting, connected, and soulful as a teacher. But it is. So number one, do you have a home practice? If you do not, there's some homework for you. Start developing a home practice. The next thing is you could choose to practice with some other yin teachers. So do you have other yin teachers in your community? Do you know of a yin teacher who maybe teaches online that you could study with? I got some classes if you're interested. I teach in registered semesters on Zoom. So it's like usually somewhere between 10 and 12 weeks. And I teach in seasonal themes. So we'll talk more about that in a moment. But if you are looking for some regular study time with a senior teacher in Yin, please check again the show notes, because there's a linky poo there for you. You are always welcome to join me. So do you have a home practice practicing with other yin teachers? That could also be, like in your community or online, right? You could also explore videos on YouTube and use those as your little sort of asana lab. You can watch the way other teachers sequence things, or ways that they teach a shape, or props that they may have used that you wouldn't have thought of. All of those things are great ways to keep things fresh. for yourself, for your own practice. Maybe it's time to dive deeper in your study. So the point of yoga is not the asana, not the physical shapes that we make with our body. It's a lovely way to practice. It's what most people practice when you say yoga, but asana is only one small part of a practice. So if you're getting bored with your own practice, are you focused only on your physical practice as a teacher? And could you add some other things in? Like maybe it's time for you to study some more philosophy or maybe some psychology. It's time for you to take a course, maybe a meditation training or a meditation course. So if you don't have a meditation practice, there again, ideal opportunity for you, dear teacher, to expand your own practice so that then that thereby will eventually expand your teaching. So are you meditating? Do you have a meditation practice? So those are ways that you can start to deepen your own experience of yin yoga. In case you didn't know, one of Yin's nicknames is the meditative yoga. So if you're like, what? Meditation? What is she talking about? Yeah, that's part of the deal. So if you don't have a meditation practice that you have regularly, that might be one of the best ways to start inspiring your home practice and also your teaching. Maybe it's time for another yin training. Oftentimes I'll hear people say, oh, well, because yin's only for the lower body, or there's only 20 poses in yin. And although my teacher, Paul, did have a very small select number of poses originally, his teachers, myself and many other senior teachers, have since added to that repertoire of poses and included a lot of stuff for the upper body. And so if your first training didn't include, poses for the upper body or anything beyond those kind of 20 poses or so that Paul did, then that might be a good opportunity for you to get some inspiration. Take another yin training. I think oftentimes people think that they're going to take 150-hour yin training and then that's it, dust off your hands, you're done, you're good forever. It doesn't work that way. And if you took less than 50 hours, it definitely does not work that way. I had over 500 hours at the time of this recording with Paul, and would, when circumstances allow, happily keep adding to that forever and ever and ever. So if you've only got a smaller training, you didn't get a lot of things maybe about meditation or about the upper body or some of these things, or maybe yin yang theory. If there were some holes maybe in your training, then maybe it's time to take another training. Inspire your own practice and to help with your students. You could go on a retreat. Sometimes getting away from your life and going and studying, whether that retreat is an actual teacher training or just a retreat for your own practice, sometimes getting kind of out of your routine, out of your rut, will really help to inspire your own practice and then thereby inspire your classes. And now that, people are traveling again, maybe you could book yourself a retreat. And whether that's a teacher training and retreat or just a public retreat, to take that opportunity to kind of reset and check out your practice from a new and inspired way again. You can explore places like YouTube, right? There's so many yin videos on YouTube, and you could, sample one a week or something. Do one YouTube practice a week from a yin teacher on YouTube and see if you get any little cool ways to go into a pose or interesting ideas there for your practice. You can always check that out. Pinterest has a lot of just like images. So if you search yin yoga, there's a lot of images and fun variations and things like that. So this is all for you as a teacher for your own practice, right? You cannot teach inspired, interesting classes if your own practice is not inspired and interesting, can you? No. So that's for those of you that you're bored with your teaching and your practice. Again, I'll just go over those real quick. First of all, you have to ask yourself, are you bored or are your students bored? If it's you, do you have a home practice? If not, there's homework number one. practice with other yin teachers, study more philosophy or psychology, take another training. So, for example, if there was some holes in your original yin training, maybe you take another training that has a different area of expertise than your first one. Maybe you want to learn more about the upper body or the meridians, or you want a trauma-informed training. I've got a great one. I might be a little biased that includes all of that. And again, you can click the link in the show notes if you want to learn more about that. So maybe it's time for another training. You can explore YouTube, Pinterest, etc. You could take time off and go on a retreat. You could develop your own meditation practice if you don't currently have one, or maybe take a meditation training, like a teacher training, so that you can guide your students. If you already have a practice for meditation, maybe that's something you add to your skill set so that you can start, practicing that in a deeper way. Okay, so that's all for if you are bored as the teacher. So then the second half of this we have to ask ourselves is, are your students bored? And don't assume they are, because most of the time, from my experience, they are not. They are content. At the end of the day, humans love consistency, and it's more nourishing to our nervous system. When there's a little bit of a sense of predictability in a class, people are able to relax in a much deeper way. So people are typically not coming to your class for some kind of creative, constantly changing sequence. They actually like showing up on the mat and knowing what's coming. In fact, there are whole styles of yoga, not yin, but other styles of yoga, like Ashtanga, for example, where people are doing the same practice every single day, sometimes for years, as they slowly learn more and more. The exact same poses in the exact same order. They have a primary series, a secondary, you get the idea. So there are whole styles of yoga where they're always doing the same thing. And guess what? Your body is not the same every single day. So you may be doing the exact same sequence every single time. It's not going to feel the same in your body, in your students' bodies. Each day it is different. Each day it is an opportunity to see that practice with fresh eyes. So cultivating interoception, which I did a whole episode on, but just briefly to describe, interoception is an awareness of what's happening inside of you. And this is one of Yin Yoga's awesome superpowers. So if you're practicing in a way to cultivate interoception, or if you're teaching your students in a way to cultivate interoception, then there's so much more going on there than the physical shape that you ask them to do. There's so much going on in their body, in their minds, in that moment. And as you become a more experienced teacher, hopefully we start to actually speak to some of those aspects of the practice, not just the make this funny shape with your body. Okay. So there are occasionally those students who are really like the vinyasa junkie students who really crave that kind of sparkly showboat class, where it's like they're expecting some creative new sequence each and every class. And they may come to your class. That is the only time I have ever experienced a student being bored with a yin practice, is if they're actually not really a yin student. They don't have a lot of experience with yin. They don't really understand the difference between yin and what they do. And they're like a vinyasa junkie. And so they want like some kind of creative sequence and some sparkly showboat practice every single class. So if that happens, you just speak to it. You just speak to the fact that this is a yin practice. And so it's different than your more dynamic, moving, flowing practices. And although that from the outside, if we were looking at a yin practice from the outside, this might look boring or predictable or simple or not fancy, because it isn't any of those things. It's very simple, functional practice, right? Functional practices. That's all yin is. But that does not mean there's not a whole bunch going on. So if you as a teacher can't speak to interoception and awareness of what is happening inside of them, if you haven't been practicing that in your own practice, that dropping inside, then it's going to be difficult for you to speak to it to your students. So this is why home practice comes first. So, for example, the pose will feel different every single time someone's in class. Now, they may not be aware of it unless they're dropping in to that interoception, but how much you slept, how much caffeine you've had, how hydrated you are, what your stress levels are like for those of us that are still menstruating, where you are in your cycle, or even for those that are approaching perimenopause or menopause, again, where you are hormonally. This What season is it? Where is the moon? And no, I'm not trying to be woo-woo about this. If you don't believe that the full moon has a big impact on the world, go talk to an ER nurse. So where's the moon that day? So there's so much that could go into the same pose feeling very different from week to week, from class to class, maybe even from the very beginning of that pose to the middle to the end. And so it's your job as a teacher, if you feel like your students are getting bored, to teach them that this is not about fancy showboat poses, that this practice is actually about dropping inside and noticing what is there. What do the sensations in my body feel like? Where are my thoughts? What emotions might be present? How does this change from one moment to the next, from one inhale to the exhale? So this level of skill comes with being a mature teacher, but also from your home practice. So I never would have been able to say, for example, to my students, can you notice the difference in this shape and how it feels on your inhale compared to your exhale, if I didn't have a home practice and I hadn't noticed that in my own body? So the reason I was able to cue that is because I had that aha in my own practice, where it was like, oh, wow, this feels so different on my inhale versus my exhale, right? So this comes from my embodied practice. And so if you don't have a home practice, you're not going to be able to guide people to speak to these things. So this is why we started with, do you have a home practice? So if you have one of those, those yoga girls, the ones that are like looking for all the fancy poses and all that, then your job as a teacher is to explain to them how yin is different than a more active or movement-based or vinyasa practice, what some of those differences might be, and then give them something else that they can do with their mind other than focusing on the exterior and the asanas and the sequence. So you can direct them, coach them, give them little hints as to other places that they could put their mind if they're bored. The air on their skin, the weight of their body on the ground, the sounds around them, their breath. Where is their breath in their body? Can they breathe into areas of sensation? Does the pose feel different on the inhale versus the exhale? Does the pose feel different right now at the start compared to now and now? And what about now? And again, the reason that I can bring all those to the forefront is because I have experienced them in my own practice. So these are the gifts of practice. Okay. So there are whole styles of yoga where they do the same thing every single class. And they're very popular styles of yoga. And no one goes in typically and is like, really, this again? Now, it will happen occasionally, but in my whole, oh God, how long have I been teaching now? 20 years of teaching, I've maybe had 2 students point out that the sequence was too similar. You could also mention that there aren't as many poses in yin, right? If somebody is really used to a vinyasa practice, they may not realize that in yin, we kind of keep things simple, that we're going to stay within this little select group of poses, and that we're actually focusing more on the function versus the form itself. So again, this is up to you as the teacher. If this situation comes up, which it rarely does, where somebody's super bored, now it's your job to point out what they could be paying attention to. Okay. There is a way to deepen the practice by incorporating, perhaps, for your students, some more philosophy. Now, don't go around just grabbing your Yoga Sutra book if you have no understanding, if you have not studied this past your 200 hour Please don't grab your Yoga Sutra book, just bring it to class and read a Yoga Sutra if you can't actually explain and understand the nuance of it or answer questions about it. That's not what I'm talking about. But if you have done some deeper studies, why not incorporate some of that yoga philosophy or any kind of deeper teaching that takes the students beyond their obsession, or your obsession maybe, with just the physical poses? So rather than changing poses all the time, can you direct them into some of these deeper things? So for example, I think as long as you as a teacher have already gone through the experience, so I often say, I don't share from my own experience the trials and tribulations of my life with my students until it's a scar, not a wound. But when it is a scar, not a wound, you might have some ahas that happened for you in yoga practice that you could share, right? So can you talk about something other than just the asana, right? The asana is one tiny part. So maybe that's yoga philosophy, or just like, you know, things that have happened in your own life, you know, transformations that you've had in your own life that yoga helped you with. Maybe it's talking to, you know, some of the deeper things in your life or about this practice. So this is beyond the physical poses. So rather than changing the poses all the time, can we talk to the deeper levels of yoga practice? Here's an example. For many, many years, I never included poetry in my classes. And the reason I didn't is because all of the classes that I went to, other than my friend Mediev, she was probably not listening to this, but her readings were very soulful. But other than her, anytime I went to a class and the teacher shared a poem, it was all just a little bit good vibes only, Pollyanna, flowery, you know, hippie stuff. And, you know, nothing wrong with that if that's your vibe, but that's not my vibe, not at all. I want to dig deep. I want to get into the shadows. I want to see things in a new way. I want to swim in the deep zone of the pool. You know, I want to dive down deep. I want it myself and my students to feel okay with understanding and embracing their shadows. I want poetry that breaks some paradigms. So that's how I roll. And so because I had always been in these classes and the poetry was so kind of like flowers, rainbows, etc., it just didn't resonate with me. If it does with you, awesome. You're going to find tons of poetry like that. Rock on with yourself. But for me, it didn't. So this is why I never included poetry readings in my class, because it would have felt like I was not being myself. Until I found online, and I'm still always hunting them down, and I always save them in my phone when I find them. Specifically, if those of you who are listening to this, her name is Maya Luna, MayaLuna, and you can find her on Instagram. I'm going to try to find her right now, but her handle changes all the time. So hopefully she won't have changed her handle by the time you hear this, but let's see what she's going by now. Okay. The Venus Path, at the Venus Path. So I discovered Maya Luna. I had a few poems kind of tucked aside. And then I discovered Maya Luna, and wow, her poems just, whew, they had my name written all over them. So I started saving those and sharing them in class. So yeah, if there's a poem that you, or a poet that you really like, you can, you know, include that poetry in your class as a way to kind of set the tone for the practice. If that's your thing. If not, don't do that. So there's a way to deepen the practice. Maybe that's yoga philosophy. Maybe that's a deeper teaching of your life. Again, when it's a scar, not a wound. Maybe it's an aha that you had with a student. Of course, we never want to talk about a specific student in class, but you could talk about a situation. Maybe it's a poem. Who knows? But can you wink to the fact that in your class that there is a whole lot more to this than just the damn asanas? They're lovely. We love them. But that's not the whole thing. Could you teach with seasonal themes? So one of the things that we do in my teacher training is we learn about the 5 elements and the seasons according to Taoism and traditional Chinese medicine. And so we learn about the meridians in brief, but more importantly, the sinew channels, because as Yin Yoga teachers, that's actually what we're accessing. And when you understand which organs and which sinew channels are connected to which elements in which season, that can allow you to teach with a seasonal theme. So, for example, I might choose more poses that access those sinew channels of the bladder meridian and the kidney meridian in the wintertime. Now, I'm not just going to do that. I'm always going to do a well-rounded practice, but that might inform the poses that I choose. And again, you shouldn't do that if you don't actually have an understanding of it. And also, dear teacher, please do not go around giving your students meridian theory in your classes. This is not skillful unless you have deep study in Chinese medicine, medical qigong, Taoism, etc. So please, I know if you learned it in your training, you're tempted to just meridian everything. Don't do it. Don't do it. But could you teach with a seasonal theme? Even though I have studied TCM fairly in depth for about 2.5, in between 2.5 and 3 years in Chinese medicine college before I dropped out, I still don't teach, meridian stuff in my class, but I will choose my sequences based on the sinew channels that are connected to the meridians. And so that can make it interesting for you as the teacher, but also for your students. They get to explore more poses and more variety of poses that way. You kind of do, these shapes that focus on these areas in the spring, these ones in the summer. You get the idea. So that's an idea. Could you just reverse the order of the poses? What happens if you took your exact same sequence and taught it backwards? It's pretty cool, actually. I play with that often. Or you invert it. You teach the middle first, and then you bookend the rest. Here's a practice that Paul used to do with us, which can be really interesting. Now, I wouldn't do this necessarily with these next two are only for, I would say, experienced Yin students. So I wouldn't do these with beginners. But if you've got a group that's been practicing with you for a while and you're worried that they're getting bored, you could do this. Paul has us do this typically at least once in every training, where you do asymmetrical poses and you do one whole side of the body before you switch to the other side. So each pose that's asymmetrical, you do, say, for example, you could do left or right, doesn't matter, but you say you do the whole right side of your body with rebounds, and then you pause for a longer rebound, and you really notice what is the difference between the right and the left side of my body, the side of my body where I've done all these shapes, the side of my body where I've done no shapes yet. And then you continue on the other side. So that's a really interesting practice that you could do if you've got a group that you think is, they're fairly experienced and they're getting bored. One thing I love to do with my students that are experienced is what I call a choose your own adventure class. So rather than me sequencing exactly which poses I want them to do, I'll say, choose a back bend of your choice. Choose a forward bend of your choice. Choose a pose for the hip butt IT bend of your choice. Now, this again only is going to work with experienced students because they have to know that there's a few and they have to kind of have a favorite before this will work. So that's a choose your own adventure class. So that can be a fun thing to do with a really experienced group of students. You could pick a theme based on the area of the body. Maybe you do a class where you're mostly doing back bends. Now, that being said, please always finish that off with a twist, a lateral pose, and some kind of a forward fold, even if it's just child's pose. Doesn't have to be equal, though. You don't have to do equal poses. I know that there's sometimes people have this pose counter pose idea, but you don't have to do that. And if you're curious about that one, I did a whole episode on sequencing. So maybe you decide, I want to do a class that's back bends. And so you do mostly a back bends, then maybe you do a twist and something lateral, and then you take some kind of a forward fold just to kind of round the practice out for their spine. Or maybe you decide, let's get into people's hips. And so you decide you're going to do a class that's got a hip focus, right? So physical area of the body can also be a way that you can keep things fresh. Can you combine poses? So for example, sometimes I'll teach a pose like butterfly or dragonfly or half dragonfly, and I'll get people to stay upright. And then I'll do some upper body stuff while we're sitting there. So their sort of inner leg is sort of starting to marinate, starting to open up in a really gentle kind of passive way, or maybe not gentle, depending on how tight they are in that area, while we do some stuff for the neck, for the shoulders, etc. And then at the end of that, I say anybody who doesn't feel this and wants to fold forward can fold forward for the last little bit. Right. So all I did there was I only took, say, half the time to tell people to fold into it. And the other half, I kept people upright with the legs in whatever shape you've chosen and multitasked a little, did some upper body, some neck, etc., some shoulders. So that's a good way to do it. Can you combine poses? Can you take a pose like, let's do a really simple one, for example, dragonfly. And can you do dragonfly in the middle and then maybe get them to turn to one leg and fold over their leg for a while? Then maybe they turn that dragonfly into a lateral pose. They bend sideways over that leg. Then they come back to the middle for a little bit, and then they do the same on the other side. So you see how I'm taking like a simple pose like dragonfly, and I'm adding extra things in that you could hold for a minute or two at a time. And that's the way to keep dragonfly fresh. Also really good for those of you who teach and don't have a lot of time in your yin classes. Sometimes having multiple things happening in a pose is the only way it's going to happen if you've only got 60 or 75 minutes for a class. So could you combine poses? If right now you're thinking, wait, what? Upper body stuff? Again, I know that the OGs, Paul, Bernie has a few upper body things in his book, but there's so many more that have been added to by seasoned yin teachers. So if you are looking for more of that, try to find a teacher that has a whole bunch of upper body stuff in their training and take another training. I got a boatload of it. So do many others. So you could combine poses. You could start offering themed workshops. So maybe you don't necessarily want to do like a seasonal theme for, your class every week, but maybe, once a quarter you offer a themed workshop, and that could be on any theme that you want. And when you start offering themed workshops as a teacher, it kind of pushes you out of your box a little bit because you got to prepare, right? In a class, it's a little easier to just show up with your sequence and, no deep thoughts, no poems, no whatever, and bing, bang, boom, get her in, get them done. But when you teach a workshop, you have to kind of cultivate a theme. You have to come up with talking points. You maybe have to find quotes. You may even have like a little slideshow presentation or something. And so maybe offering more themed workshops seasonally might be a way for you to kind of start to picture what that might look like if you added some of those elements then to your weekly classes. Okay. Could you include meditation? So I want to be really clear here that I'm really not encouraging you to guide meditation if you don't have a meditation practice and you haven't taken any meditation training. So I just want to say that we shouldn't really be guiding things that we've never studied. But if you have some meditation experience, if you have a meditation practice, if you've taken some meditation teacher training, maybe you've even written some guided meditations of your own, what if you started including meditation in your classes? Because that is actually kind of the point. Like these funny shapes that we make with our body, not the point. The point is to create a body that is stable and healthy with good chi flow so that we can do these deeper practices, right? So maybe starting to include meditation. And again, if you don't have a meditation practice, that's not going to be a good fit for you, or if you haven't taken any meditation training. But if you're interested in those things and you start studying them for your own practice, then you can start sharing them. So just to summarize that section of how can we make our classes more interesting for students if they are bored. First thing to mention, most of them aren't. It's in your head, dear teacher, you are bored. They are probably not. 90% of the time, your students are not bored. They are content to do the same thing over and over and over again because it's more nourishing to their nervous system to have something that is familiar and predictable. It's the same reason that people that suffer from anxiety, for example, will watch the same movie over and over, right? It's like a little feel-good fix. You know what's coming. It's your favorite movie. So this is like their class, right? If they do the similar sequence all the time or similar poses, they're probably not mad at that. Now, there is the odd, maybe not even 10% of students who might be those sparkly showboat vinyasa students who like are all about the fancy sequence. And if that is in your class, if those people come and they're bored, now it's on you, dear teacher, to make this practice interesting for them. What is interesting about a yin practice beyond the physical shapes? There's your work. And if you don't know, try a home practice. Could you start offering more philosophy or psychology or some of the deeper teachings of these physical, rather than just the physical poses? Could you, include some transformative things in your own life, some journeys you've been on in your own life, again, when it's a scar, not a wound? Could you start incorporating some seasonal themes? You could reverse the order of the poses. You could do Paul's practice, which I quite love actually, of doing only asymmetrical poses, so poses that have a left and a right, and doing one whole side of the body and then pausing to notice and then doing the other side. For experienced students, you could offer a choose your own adventure class where you just call out the kind of pose you are guiding and they choose which one. Could you use an area of the body? Perhaps. Maybe you do back bends. Maybe you do hips. Maybe you do a whole sequence of like upper back, neck, shoulders. Like who knows, right? Can you use an area of the body? Paul does this on his, what was a DVD. It's now streaming on Pranamaya. And for those of you who don't know that Paul actually did have a yin DVD, he does. He has the anatomy DVD, which is not yin specific. It's for all styles of yoga. But then he has a yin yoga, an old school yin yoga practice with a few practices on it. So you could check that out. But he has on there like a hip series and a spine series, right? So you could pick an area of the body as your theme to keep things fresh. You could combine poses. So is there a pose where the legs are doing something for a little while? Maybe you could add some upper body or some side body in with that. Again, the examples I used were dragonfly, half dragonfly, butterfly. Could you start offering themed workshops as a way to sort of push yourself as a teacher, to encourage those students that do want to go deeper, that do want a little bit more? They can sign up for your workshops. And then you can take some of those little things from that workshop and sprinkle them into your classes afterwards as well. Could you include meditation? Now, again, if you haven't studied meditation, if you don't have a meditation practice, don't do that. That's an opportunity for you to grow as a yoga practitioner before you share it as a yoga teacher. You have to share from your own practiced lived experience. But for those of you that do have a meditation practice, are you including even just 5 minutes of meditation in your classes? And if not, why not? And then, in summary, to close this episode, I'm going to say once again, please remember, dear teacher, yin yoga is not entertainment. Yin yoga is not entertainment. We are not trying to entertain our students with all kinds of fancy, sparkly things. Instead, focus on holding brave space for your students and nudging them into a deeper experience of themselves. As a teacher, learn to cultivate interoception for yourself so that then you understand how to guide or coach or encourage interoception with your students. Because yin yoga is an inside out practice, not an outside in practice. So remember, yin yoga is not entertainment. And if you are bored, it doesn't mean your students are bored, but I've given you some great ideas on either side of that coin, whether you're bored or your students are bored. Okay, dear teacher, I hope that you found this helpful. Please feel free to reach out and let me know what you think of this episode. Again, you can find me on Instagram at Nick Danu Yoga or at Yin Yoga Podcast. Both of those will be linked in the show notes. And let me know what you thought of this episode, what your takeaways were. If you are watching this on YouTube, would you mind subscribing and liking this video? And then leave me a comment. What did you take away from this episode? Were there any ahas or ideas that I shared that you hadn't thought of that can help to keep either your own practice fresh or your teaching fresh? If so, let me know in the comments. And until we meet again, bye for now.